Okay.
Professor Kwame Dawes, Emmy-winning Jamaican poet and writer and poet of Jamaica, of the Faculty of Humanities and Education. Dr. Dave Goss, Senior Lecturer and Director of the Institute of Caribbean Studies. Dr. Candia Mitchell Hall, Lecturer, ICS, and other members of the faculty of the ICS, the department ICS, other lecturers of the University of the West Indies, and of universities abroad. Our student in the room from myself, Miss Melissa in cultural studies. Other and we will just pick up where we left off. We are provided where we are doing this lecture from the Institute of Caribbean Studies here in the Faculty of Humanities and Education. And we are so happy to have this distinguished lecturer this evening. The title of the lecture today is 150 Years of Intellectual and Cultural Engagement with the African Diaspora, a Family's Story. And we are looking forward to the great presentation that lies ahead. We want to thank all of you who have joined us on the platform. We just want to let you know that you'll be able to interact with our lecturer later on. We are asking you to put your questions in the chat on the YouTube platform, and we will pull out your questions and share them with our lecturer. But right now we're going to move the program along. We will talk more about Stuart Hall as the evening goes on, but we have to be welcomed properly. And I'm not the one who is going to be doing that. We are going to let the man who is leading the ICS, Dr. Dave Goss, bring the welcome. I think you're still mute, Dr. Goss.
Yeah. Thank you so very much, Hugh, and a pleasant good evening to everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 5th annual Stuart Hall Distinguished Lecture, hosted by the Institute of Caribbean Studies and the Reggae Studies Unit. As we recognize Stuart Hall, this former head boy at Jamaica College, we are forced to remember the Windrush generation, these Caribbean migrants to the United Kingdom, and their impact on global history and culture. In 1951, when Stuart Hall left Jamaica and arrived in London on a Rhodes Scholarship to study English language, it could not have entered his mind that 13 years later, in 1964, that he would be one of the founding fathers of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. In the 1960s and 1970s, the idea of serious academic interrogation into studying popular culture, I dare say, was unpopular. Hall's interest and emphasis in the study of culture concerned the lived experiences, the interpretation and meaning of those experiences, and the information which can be revealed about people, their environment, and their relationships to each other and to the state. Being born in Jamaica helped to shape his development, and the instrument Hall would classify as cultural studies. Jamaica being a society centered on power relations around race, class, and ethnicity. As a result, cultural studies around the world owes a great debt to Hall and his contemporaries. This Stuart Hall District Lecture, therefore, sets out to honor the life and work of a Jamaican-born cultural theorist and world-renowned intellectual for the contributions he has made as a founding father of cultural studies and to many other disciplines, which includes media, sociology, politics, and minority studies. It is also a pleasure, therefore, to have one of our distinguished poets, Professor Kwame Dawes, Jamaica's current poet laureate, deliver this 5th distinguished Stuart Hall lecture. Professor Dawes will be introduced shortly, but we are honored to be participants in his family's story, 150 years of intellectual and cultural engagement with the African diaspora. As the poet speaks, let us use the opportunity to remember Stuart Hall's work and the important role of language and culture. Let us also honor other Caribbean scholars, such as Camus Brathwaite and his insistence on using nation language and accepting the reality of our creolized Caribbean culture. We must not forget the work of Guyanese and modern scholar Hubert Devenish, his work on language and liberation, Creole language and politics in the Caribbean. We must not forget Jamaica's Louise Bennett Coverley, affectionately known as Miss Lou, and her popularizing of poetry in the Jamaican language. Jamaicans like myself are a product of Miss Lou's Ring Ding. That was the only local Creole show that my devoted anglicized mother would allow me to watch. The important role of language in developing our culture and our distinct Caribbean identity is the reason we have international stars such as Bob Marley's reggae, the Calypsonian Mighty Sparrow, Rihanna's pop and R&B, Derek Walcott's Nobel Prize for poetry 1992, and Emmy-winning poet of 2009, Kwame Dawes. Again, we welcome Professor Dawes, the poet, as he speaks. Let me also use this opportunity to also welcome our hardworking Dean, Professor Sylvia Cohenberg, fellow head of department in our faculty, fellow colleagues here at UWI, Mona, former HODs of the ICS, fellow colleagues on other campuses, friends of the ICS, students, visitors, and other specially invited guests. The ICS RSU as an academic unit in the Faculty of Humanities and Education here at UWI Mona is committed to this academic dialogue to affirm Caribbean language, to affirm our creatives, and to deepen our conversation with our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean. It is conversations such as this distinguished Stuart Hall lecture that highlights UWI's educational imperative to advance learning, create knowledge, and foster innovation for the positive transformation of the Caribbean and the wider world. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you again to the 5th annual Distinguished Stuart Hall Lecture.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dave Goss, the Director of the Institute of Caribbean Studies at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. And what a wonderful welcome and a wonderful context that you have set up for us for this Stuart Hall lecture. And a lot of persons are not aware that Stuart Hall is one of the fathers of cultural studies, emerging from the British School of Cultural Studies, one of the founders of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, out of which the discipline of cultural studies, which is housed within the Institute of Caribbean Studies, one of the founders of that wonderful discipline. And so this is really, I know, a dear to heart engagement for our director and indeed all the lecturers of the ICS. Thank you again, Dr. Goss. And you were quite right. The next speaker has really made great impact in her leadership as Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Education. And so it is with pleasure that I now invite to bring greetings Professor Sylvia Cohenberg, the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Education. Welcome, Dean.
Thank you very much, Hugh. I am happy to be here in my capacity as Dean and to be able to speak on behalf of the Faculty of Humanities and Education. We see ourselves very much as the place that has inherited the legacy of the ideas and insights of Stuart Hall. And, you know, in a country where the culture that has emerged from the so-called lower social classes is the culture that has made Jamaica what it is, has put Jamaica on the global map, is of huge interest in a transnational way. It is still the case that the language and culture of the elite is somehow reified as having more value. And so that is the kind of ambiguity in which we operate and in which cultural studies, of which cultural studies has to make sense somehow. As you know, as a linguist, I'm also somebody who grapples with that very ambiguous, these very ambiguous thoughts about culture in the Jamaican context. So, it's a great tradition to have these lectures in the name of Stuart Hall, and it's a lecture that I look forward to. And of course, Professor Kwame Dawes is someone with whom this faculty has a long association. It is Professor Dawes is somebody whose own work has been very influential and has inspired members of this faculty. And I look forward to hearing his insights on 150 years of intellectual and cultural engagement. It's an ambitious title, and I'm sure we will be the better for hearing the contents of this lecture. So welcome to the Faculty of Humanities and Education.
Thank you so much, Professor Cohenberg, and thank you for the support that you constantly and continuously give to the programs of the ICS and all things within the faculty that are about discovering more about our identities. Thank you so very much for your greetings. Now, before we have the introduction of the speaker, I'm just gonna share a couple facts about Stuart Hall that many people don't know. I think Dr. Goss mentioned that he is a JC old boy. He was a Rhodes Scholar. But how many of us know that Stuart Hall is the one who coined the term Thatcherism? How many of us know that he is as frequently researched and cited on at least online platforms as Karl Marx has been? If you were to do a Google search, and the number of references you would see for Stuart Hall exceed actually anything that you would see for someone like Karl Marx. And how many of us know that Stuart Hall was a member of the Windrush generation who grew up in Jamaica until he was in his late teens before going off to study at Oxford? I bet you didn't know some of that. But we want to challenge you to learn more about Stuart Hall. He's an immensely important Jamaican thinker, and I am really honored to have had the chance to be a host this evening for this event because he's at the core of a lot of my own work. But let's move the program along. I'm now going to invite to introduce our very special speaker this evening, Dr. Candia Mitchell Hall, lecturer at the ICS.
Thank you, Hugh. Greetings, everyone. On behalf of the Institute of Caribbean Studies and the Reggae Studies Unit, I am delighted to introduce this remarkable, prolific and award-winning, Emmy-winning poet and scholar, Professor of Literary Arts and Poet Laureate of Jamaica, Professor Kwame Dawes. Kwame Dawes was born in Ghana in 1962 to Neville Dawes, who was born in Nigeria to Jamaican parentage, and Sophia Dawes, who was from Ghana. Dawes would spend his formative years in Jamaica, where he grew up in the context of the Black cultural movement and struggles for cultural representation, as Stuart Hall would say. In 1971, the Dawes family moved from Ghana to Jamaica when his father secured a job as deputy director at the Institute of Jamaica. Dawes would go on to attend the prestigious Jamaica College and the University of the West Indies, where he read for a Bachelor of Arts degree in Literatures in English in 1983. By 1992, he would earn a Doctor of Philosophy in Comparative Literature from the University of New Brunswick in Canada. And he would spend the next 20 years of his life at the University of South Carolina as Professor of Liberal Arts, teaching English from 1992 to 2012. The years at the University of South Carolina would be productive ones for Dawes, and his entire life story would be quite productive. And it would set the tone for his academic career as an architect of the African Caribbean literary landscape. Dawes would go on to produce over 17 collections of poetry, which would reflect his personal and socio-cultural context as a son of the African and Caribbean soil, emboldened by the spirits and the songs and the rhythms of the collective human experience across time and space. One of his first works, Progeny of Air, published in 1994, won the Forward Poetry Prize for Best First Collection in the United Kingdom, a remarkable early accomplishment announcing to the literary world that a new intellectual voice from the diaspora had emerged to connect African Caribbean peoples to a sense of place, belonging, self, family, and community. Dawes would go on to demonstrate his literary mastery and expertise with poems like Resisting the Anome, published in 1995, Prophets, also published in 1995, Jaco Jacobus, published in 1996, and Requiem, a suite of poems which would respond to a book written by African-American artist Tom Fillings entitled Middle Passage, White Ships, Black Cargo. Other collections like Shook Foil, published in 1998, a collection of reggae-inspired poems, and Midland would win the Hollis Summers Poetry Prize, and his long poem Inheritance would earn him a Pushcart Prize in 2001. He would go on to publish other notable works of poetry like Wheels, published in 2011, Back of Mount Peace, published in 2009, Hope's Hospice, and Wisteria, which was selected as a finalist for the Patterson Memorial Prize. And then, of course, Impossible Flying, published in 2007, and Goma's Song, also published in the same year. His 17th collection, City of Bones, appeared in 2017, and by 2018, he would receive the Wyndham Campbell Prize from the University of Yale in recognition of his profound contribution to the art of poetry. Dawes' most recent books include Sturge Town, the acclaimed Sturge Town, published in 2023. Another was Nebraska in 2019, and Duppy Conquering, published in 2013, which was also shortlisted for a Penn Award Prize in the same year. Now, beyond poetry, Dawes has established himself as a compelling novelist with novels like Bivouac and She's Gone, the latter of which would earn the 2008 Hurston Wright Legacy Award for Best First Novel. His insightful personal narrative, A Far Cry from Plymouth Rock, was published in 2007. And his many thought-provoking essays have graced the pages of esteemed journals such as Bomb Magazine, the London Review of Books, Granta Essence, World Literature Today, and Double Take Magazine. Furthermore, his cultural engagement with reggae is brilliantly represented in his seminal work, Bob Marley, Lyrical Genius, which remains the definitive exploration of Marley's powerful lyrics, performances, and socio-political context in the Jamaican society. Additionally, Dawes' influence extends to the realm of literary curation as the editor of several significant anthologies, including Bearden's Odyssey, Poets Respond to the Art of Romare Bearden, A Bloom of Stones, a trilingual anthology of Haitian poems after the earthquake, New Generation African Poets, a chapbook box set, When the Rewards Can Be So Great, Essays on Writing and the Writing Life, Hold Me to an Island, Caribbean Place, an anthology of writing, and Home is Where, an anthology of African American poetry from the Carolinas, and so much more. In 2009, his human rights work led to an Emmy Award for LiveHopeLove.com, an interactive online site and project born from his Pulitzer Center work centered around the title Hope, Living and Loving with HIV/AIDS in Jamaica. This groundbreaking project also received a People's Voice Webby Award and inspired the powerful music and spoken word performance Wisteria and Hope, premiering at the National Black Theatre Festival in North Carolina. Moreover, his impactful reporting on HIV/AIDS in Haiti following the earthquake of 2010 through the lens of poems, blogs, articles, and documentary work contributed to the Pulitzer Center's post-earthquake Haiti coverage, which earned the National Press Club, of which he's a member, a Joan Frydenberg Award for online journalism. Ladies and gentlemen, we are clearly in the presence of greatness. Dawes is not only an academic, poet, writer, and editor. He is also a dynamic presence in the performing arts as an actor, playwright, accomplished storyteller, and producer. He was also the former lead singer of the popular reggae band Ujamaa. Music pulsates deep within his veins. 15 of his plays performed on stage, where he would also take on roles as actor, director, and producer. And most recently, he performed his One Love play at the Lyric Hammersmith Theatre in London. Commissioned by the Talawa Theatre Company, Dawes' One Love play, which was inspired by Roger May's Brother Man, takes us to the heart of the Jamaican soul. It tells a powerful parable of desire and denial. His collaborative performances with musicians and artists such as Kevin Simmons has led to the adaptation of his book, Wisteria, to be performed in music, which would showcase his poetry in compelling new dimensions. Wisteria, in particular, explores the lives of women during the Jim Crow era in South Carolina through a mesmerizing blend of poetry and music. Added to his significant accomplishments, he would serve as Distinguished Poet in Residence, Louis Fryer Shuda Professor of Liberal Arts, and founder and executive director of the South Carolina Poetry Initiative. He continues to teach and mentor students to hone their creativity and writing skills at the Pacific University in Oregon, and he serves as director of the African Poetry Book Fund and artistic director of the Calabash International Literary Festival in Jamaica. Moreover, in 2022, Dawes was named the 2022 Brittle Paper Person of the Year by University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he was awarded with the prestigious Order of Distinction Commander by the government of Jamaica for his stellar contribution to the literary arts. By 2024, he would receive a Lifetime Achievement Award from James Madison University in Virginia. And in the same year, he would be named the Poet Laureate of Jamaica for the years 2024 to 2027. Currently, he is Chancellor for the Academy of American Poets and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and Professor of Literary Arts at Bronx College and a faculty member of Cave Canem. Ladies and gentlemen, I did mention that we are in the presence of eminence. So please help me welcome an outstanding African and Caribbean son of the soil, Professor Kwame Dawes, whose presentation for the 5th Stuart Hall Distinguished Lecture is entitled 150 Years of Intellectual and Cultural Engagement with the African Diaspora, a Family History.
Thank you very much for that very generous and quite thorough introduction. I felt very tired at the end of it. It's so much. But I'm really appreciative of this opportunity to give this lecture and to all who have been involved in the planning and organization of it. And I want to make sure that we have ample time for questions and so on. So I'm keen to jump into it. I'll begin with some poems. Well, with a poem. Acceptance by Neville Dawes. I praise the glorious summers of Pimento, sun purple, riper than the wet red clay smell of my youth. By corn light and river run, as dog and I, we screamed the small green hill, and the salt smooth wind from the leaping sea sang in the yellow sunflower. I praised the dumb, scared child I was in coffee groves and the barbecues of graves, smelling of ghosts, old country flesh, laid by my father for his tribe, fictitious as angels. A small alone boy riding to harvest hymns in the green of the day as the shackle bell tongued on the churchy hilltop. I praise the legends we made when the drunk hawks and worse were merry, waltzed up the day, hallowed the mountains of birds and the nestling curve of the reeling river. Swam those eyes reading the first gardens, blush and Adams, when weathers twisted the old thunder voice. I was King Arthur's irrelevant steed on the lightning page, castling all races, all men, the drunk hawks, and worse, climbing together to the top of the colorless rain in the dappling sun. I praise all this returning to a shower of mango blossoms, the creaking village, the old eyes, the graves, the sun's kiss, and lonely as ever, as the bare cedars, I walk by the stream where boys still plash dusking and falling in the star apple sunset, and find her there, ancient as the lost lands, bandanaed and gray and calling. Then I read the monumental legend of her love and grasp her wrinkled hands. I think in this poem by my father, he contains in it that final moment, a kind of moment of epiphany, but a moment of connection. It is a real lived moment that is connecting him to his ancestral village, to the village of Sturgetown. It's a moment that connects him to his mother and then to his ancestors. But in a sense, this woman becomes the embodiment of Africa, the embodiment of the African in the diaspora, and that reach to grasp her hands, to grasp her wrinkled hands and read the monumental legend of her love, constitutes what I think is at the heart of what I want to talk about today. I offer a way of justifying the ambition of my title, which includes the number 150 years. A basic argument which positions it, which will take us to 1875 if we're to count the years, and which, as it happens, would be just a few years after the birth of my grandfather, Levi Dawes. And at the center of my formation as a writer has been my formation as a person born of the complex narrative of migration and landings, a narrative that is a core truth of the last 200 years in a world of increased migrations and communication and profound cultural upheavals. So the story I'm telling here, and in a sense, it is an account, it is an exploration of what I think is the intellectual history, but at heart, it is the story and a story that I continue to speak as an act against erasure. It's peculiarly central to my sense of self. And it's a self shaped by an ancestral rooting that places me at once as a native African and as a multi-generational descendant of the African diaspora. I should explain this briefly. I am a native African because I was born in Africa, in West Africa, in Ghana. But I'm also, on the other side of my family, a descendant of people of the African diaspora. As a poet, I found in the rupture and disquiet of unbelonging and the empathetic journey towards belonging an aesthetic shaped by being both inside and outside of lived experience. My biography, when spoken in the sketchy way of terms, is at once unique as it is a wholly 19th century phenomenon. I was born in Ghana in 1962 to a Jamaican father and a Ghanaian mother. This simple articulation is simple enough, but quickly positions me as a product of a distinctive foment of cultural making that belies a truly rich complex of cultural histories. Consider that Ghana gained its independence from British in 1956 and Jamaica became independent a few days after I was born in 1962. That my family would migrate to Jamaica in the early 1970s as a kind of return, and I would be shaped by the exciting historical moment of 1970s Jamaica in which the nation wrestled with its relationship with Africa in the construction of its imaginary, such that I was an alien in that country, and my body and sense of self was slowly being contended with by a nation with an outsized cultural power in the world, and that was no small thing. So to live in Jamaica in the 1970s consciously was to live as if the 200 to 300 years prior were indeed a present force, a present reality. I've often spoke of studying from the book, The People Who Came, while a first former at Jamaica College in 1973. And in the next few years, until I did O-levels, being immersed in European history as well as West Indian history, where we learned about slavery, the plantation system, the genocide of the Arawaks, as we call them then, Taino is the term that is more favored now, and much more. We took field trips to places like Maroon Town, where we watched the descendants of formerly enslaved people who had fought successfully for their freedom, carrying out rituals that retained the language and practices of the Akan people, firing their muskets and blowing their bang. We were being taught by highly conscious and progressive young men and women like Mrs. Sobers and Mr. Ward Mills. Our vice principal, Jimmy Carnegie, was a historian, all a generation of people trained at the University of the West Indies and trained at a time when the consciousness of identity, of Africanness, and so on and so forth was taking place globally, but certainly taking place in Jamaica. And these people were being guided by a passion for teaching, yes, but an intense sense of consciousness shaped by the music and intellectual work happening in the country. So as we learned about slavery in the classroom, on the buses, the music of Burning Spear and Bob Marley and Culture, Judy Mort, were narrating a history, that history, as if it was actually and acutely and relevantly present. Do you remember the days of slavery? Every time I hear the crack of a whip, my blood runs cold. I remember on the slave ship how they brutalized our very soul. The repetition of phrases and language that made that lived moment of slavery both mythologically present and relevant to the context of Jamaican society at the time was the milieu in which I was growing up. Whether I liked it or not, I think I was being shaped by it. But that was at Jamaica College. And it amazes me what a difference a few years made. My first encounter with Jamaican schooling was as a student at Shortwood Practicing School. And this was in 1971. There we arrived, my sister and I, speaking with strong Ghanaian accents, inflected by the Cockney that we had picked up after a year in Eastern London. My teacher complained that she did not understand what I was saying. And I complained that I did not understand what she was saying. We were both absolutely certain that we were speaking English. My classmates had no doubt that I was an African. I spoke like one. I looked like one. Somehow it did not occur to them that I looked like them. So the teasing began, and it was intense. We developed a coping system that was predicated on complete irony and a collusion about how to take the teasing and turn it on itself. And if they asked whether we lived in trees, we said yes, and went one better, that we knew Tarzan and that we knew the Phantom. If they asked us if we saw wild animals, we explained that we actually had pet lions and snakes in our homes. And when they accused me of being a wild boy, I would respond to any threat of violence by leaping on the desk and grunting and shouting in my best version of the savage I could muster. If I was not a true African, they concluded, I was at least a madman, which is what happened to people who lived in Britain for too long. Much of this may seem amusing, and it is amusing in retrospect and from a distance, but it was difficult at the time. As I navigated this gauntlet of acceptance, I was also coming to a full understanding that the language I needed to learn was Jamaican, Patois. For the next 3 years, I practiced Jamaican, understood that it had its own grammar, and became adept at it in the most studious ways, in ways that most Jamaicans were not aware of or didn't have to. It was their native tongue. It was their mother tongue. They didn't even have to think about it as a grammar, as a lexicon, any of those things. Yet as a child, I had to be learning this language. At Shortwood, there was also some respite. And it came in the form of the Rastafarian men who sold oranges and peanuts at the bottom gate on Olivier Road. They had heard that I was an African, and they invited me to sit with them and tell them about Africa. This may have happened a few times, but I've probably turned it into a great myth of a rite of passage. I told them about the fruits, the trees, the food, the music, the yoyi, the banku, the fufu. I told them about the houses we lived in. I did not like to think about think about becoming a Rasta, but what I liked about it was that I didn't have to lie to them about my life growing up in urban Accra. I didn't have to lie. I could be as honest as possible. And I did not lie about spending summers under the shadow of the Elmina Castle in Cape Coast. This dialogue with Rastas would come, bring to life become a long one that would continue for the rest of my life, and an affirming one, because I believe that there is truth to the proposition that one of the greatest forces for the amelioration of the attitude of Jamaicans to their African past can be located in Rastafarianism and in what Rastas were doing with reggae music and the effort to make sense of the bold claim of Africanness within Jamaican people. On the radio, the reggae revolution unfolded with songs of historical lament and ferocity. Africa was the promised land, and the system of oppression of the day, the systems were metaphorized into the poetics of enslavement, lamentation, liberation, and revolution. What I had not known was that when my father was advancing the cause of Africa as the inevitable inheritance of Jamaicans in his role as the first Black man to head the Institute of Jamaica, what I didn't know was that he was fulfilling a dream and ideology held by his father and his uncle and his own ancestors. What I did not know was that my father's birth in Warri, Nigeria in 1926 was part of a remarkable story of repatriation that long predated the fiery arrival of even Marcus Garvey. My grandfather, Augustus Levi Dawes, was born in the same parish as Garvey, a decade or so before Garvey. My grandfather chose to travel to Warri, Nigeria in the early 1900s some years after his brother had migrated to Ghana, where he himself had died. But let's be clear about the complexity of this effort. A scholar called Phil Jansen recently published a book, and the title of the book was An Unformed Map, Geographies of Belonging Between Africa and the Caribbean, which was published with Duke University Press. Here's the description of the book, and it's worth reading it in its full. It's a little long, but I want to read it so we understand some context. In An Unformed Map, Philip Jansen traces the intellectual trajectories of Caribbean people who joined the British and French colonial administrations in Africa between 1890 and 1930. Caribbean administrators grew up in colonial societies, saw themselves as British and French, and tended to look down on Africans. Once in Africa, however, they were doubly marginalized, excluded by the Europeans, and unwelcome among Africans. This marginalization was then reproduced in colonial archives where their lives appear only in fragments. Drawing on sources beyond the archives of empire, from dictionaries and language exams to a suitcase full of poems, Jansen considers how Caribbean administrators reckoned with the profound effects of assimilation, racism, and dislocation. As they learned African languages, formed relationships with African intellectuals, and engaged with African cultures and histories, they began to rethink their positions in the British and French empires. They also created new geographies of belonging across the Atlantic, foundations from which others imagined new political horizons. Ultimately, Jansen offers a model for reading across sources and writing history in the face of archival fragmentation. So, end quote. Now, Jansen had approached me some years ago while he was working on this book, because he had come across the name of my grandfather, Levi Dawes, as one of those individuals who had taken up this offer from the Colonial Office in the UK. My grandfather never made it into Jansen's study because he was not able to find enough material that would fit into the structure that he had created for the book. But I did do my own work and tracked down articles, diary entries, and intriguing accounts by my grandfather, who in the early 20th century settled in Nigeria with his wife, and by early I mean 1908, 1908, with his wife, and there they had 4 children, my father being the last born in 1926. I want to pause briefly, just quickly, to imagine somebody in the late 1800s, a Black Jamaican man, thinking to himself that he has an opportunity to go to Africa. This is living among people who themselves were enslaved. This is at a time when Africa was not a distant space, but a place in which enslaved Africans had still existed, right? And making the decision to go to Africa represented a kind of revolutionary act of thinking that this connection has validity. However, as Jansen argues, for many of them, it seemed as if this was an opportunity for them to become part of the colonizing effect of the British Empire. But what I began to discover in the papers of my grandfather and so on was something slightly different. My grandfather may well have been thinking about the opportunity afforded by this work. And he had studied at MICO, he was a teacher, he was a lay preacher, but he saw an opportunity that he took up. And he took up at a time when Garvey was preaching repatriation, but he decided that he was going to Africa. But it becomes clear in the newspaper accounts I found in Jamaica of his return trips to Jamaica that he was carrying out a quite different enterprise than that of advancing the colonial efforts of the British. In a few articles there were notices of large meetings organized with farmers in Jamaica to discuss some of the farming techniques used in Nigeria and explored how they could be adapted to Jamaica. And he spoke of taking some of the techniques in Jamaica in the farming work that they did to the delta lands of Nigeria. In other words, he explicitly spoke about an exchange of cultures, an exchange of techniques, an exchange of practices, and a way of doing it. It was clear that he considered these cultures to be deeply connected and working on equal terms of exchange and learning. In none of the notes I saw in his diaries, which were largely ledgers detailing the cost of provisions, the materials he needed in his community, the work on the church, the education of his children, were any hints of superiority or presumed authority over the African world where his children had grown up. And yet, without making a heroic figure of him, I can simply engage the facts of his life and legacy as a way of saying that he was doggedly committed to embracing his Africanness, his Blackness, and the kind of awareness and understanding that would characterize much of what Marcus Garvey would embrace. My grandfather was a churchman, and he did not see this as distinct from his core Africanness and Jamaicanness. It does make sense that my father would always be clear of where he was born, even though he was 4 years old when he moved to Jamaica. Now, my father was a self-declared Marxist and Pan-Africanist, the latter identity I learned he had come to legitimately. And these three generations unfolded three models of the African diaspora that have come to shape my life and especially my art. My father was at JC, Jamaica College, as a scholarship boy, decades before I was there. But he would have, and he was, of course, a very good friend of Stuart Hall. And they shared a great deal in terms of their way of thinking. And you'd see it in something that I would say here. He would leave there and go to Oxford University, where he read English, and he returned to Jamaica to teach at Calabar High School. I would find in his letters and his own writing a wrestling with Jamaica at the time. He expressed both a visceral antipathy for the retrograde ways of middle-class Jamaica, and at the same time, he found himself as part of the anti-colonial effort towards a cultural and ideological independence. From everything I could find, the moment there was a possibility for him to travel to Africa, he took it up. He left Jamaica with his wife and daughter, and they landed in Kumasi, Ghana, where he took up teaching posts at the School of Technology there. For 15 years, he would grow up as a Marxist, as a teacher, and as a leader of the Pan-Africanist movement. And he would end his first marriage and then remarry my mother, a Ghanaian woman of Ewe and Akan heritage. And they would have 5 children, all born in Ghana. My father, too, was filling a void, resisting the patterns of historical erasure that had haunted the people of the Caribbean and Africans from the Caribbean. I'm proposing that in the lives of these individuals, which are part of the legacy that I've grown up with, there was this idea that the connection with Africa was not a fantasy, was not a myth, something to be hidden, but something to be embraced and to be understood in very pragmatic terms. So that I came from this complex heritage is perhaps one of the most telling features of my body of work. I'm married to a woman for whom the heritage of travel and migration is endemic. Her mother was born in Panama to Jamaican workers. Her father was a Jamaican rural man who took his family to England as part of the Windrush generation. And my wife was born in London. We both arrived in Jamaica the very same year, not knowing anything about each other. And when we met at UWI, we found a great affinity in this long story of history of movement, landings, and departures. I can't give you the full details of that constitutes the basis of this talk, a framing that tells the whole story of how 3 generations of Black people have confronted the grand and tragic narrative of forced migration and the shaping of the rise of Western power over the past 500 years in ways that reflect the language of legacy, of memory, and of language rich with the optimism of a Black future. In the face of silencing and erasure, this story reminds us of the power and necessity of knowing and of archival truth. I will just want to end with a couple of quick statements because, again, like I said, I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure that we have some time for questions and so on. Now, I am a poet. I consider myself a citizen of Africa and her diaspora. In me are the channels of blood that enact the stability of the uninterrupted indigenous rootedness to Africa and the constantly evolving and creatively renewing sense of Africa in its diaspora. What I offer here is framed around the inheritance and the legacy of words. their flawed limitations, and their urgent power. The words are crystallized in the poems, letters, and essays of my father, the journal entries, news clippings, and shipping ledgers of my grandfather's story, and in my own poems, which find their meaning in the detritus of memory and in the archives of a family collecting ways to understand themselves around the idea of belonging, of acceptance, and an idea that is rooted in the contention with the idea of Africa. At the heart of what I hope to have conveyed here is the consideration of the body of my father, the bodies of my father, my grandfathers, my mother, my grandmothers, the inheritance of the body, the shape of our bodies, and the way that we have found such different ways to consider our Black bodies in a global space. I spent much of my life being affirmed by and affirming the rich and complex legacy of Africa and her diaspora. At each point of encounter, I have found myself correcting a built-in system of colonialism's effort to erase the existence and the power of this legacy. Many have dismissed and denigrated the entire edifice of Rastafarianism by proposing that it is predicated on a myth, a complete invention, and a dream. Some of our own poets and writers have gone as far as to mock this process of myth-making, to ridicule the dreams of a return to Africa. This is one of the most unfortunate acts that have effectively endorsed the agenda of colonial erasure, the invention of the dream of Africa, the land that Bunny Wailer, through an act of double appropriation, first from a country song from the American South, and secondly from the persistent language of return to Africa in his song Dreamland, constitutes the necessary creation of a myth of connection, the bridging that battles the effort to draw a line of amnesia along the coast of the Atlantic. The poet, I have come to believe fully, the poets, they are the peculiar carriers of the critical fact of the existence of our bodies in the world. And I call the poets the chroniclers of the sentiment of their times. And their articulations have come to serve as a means of reminding us of the human struggle to live, to love, to dream, to believe, to create, to invent, and to survive in this world. In cultures around the world, the poetry found in proverbs, songs, sayings, and the spoken and written work of the imagination. So I would like to suggest that at the end of the day, the retrieval of the poets, the retrieval of the stories, the retention of the stories is a fight against the erasure, and the erasure that has a visceral impact on our sense of who we are. That if we believe that there was nothing before us, that it was all darkness, as Conrad would suggest, and that there were not people living, loving, creating, thinking, and adding to the world. If we believe that because of the calculated effort of the colonial enterprise, then we become victim to that. What I believe in the legacy of my own history, of retrieving it and understanding it, going back into the past, is that built into the lived life of these people, these individuals, was the desire to understand their presence in the world and to understand that they come from a place, a history. And then by inheritance, I too come from that place. So I'll end it there and be happy to engage questions and discussions about what I've talked about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Dawes, for our most engaging, most rich, most thought-provoking lecture, 150 years of intellectual and cultural engagement with the African diaspora, a family's story. What an important story you have told this evening. And I know that our audience has much to ask, to say, and again, I'm going to remind us that we are invited to put our questions in the chat of the YouTube feed that you are receiving, and our wonderful support from Mrs. Bettine Ross Laws of the ICS and from Onika as well will allow us to engage. But I must tell you, I have a book of notes from what you have said, Professor Dawes, and I must say how much we hear from your talk on the idea of being disconnected, of rupture, of the need for belonging. So much resonates in that from the work and life of Stuart Hall. And it's so ironic that your father went to school with Stuart, you went to JC. There are some parallel lines in dealing with the colonial experience. But one of the things I want to really zone in on is the obvious shift that would have had to happen with Augustus Levi in his being in between the colonial administration and the African presence when he went to Africa. I must tell you that I when I was listening, I was saying to myself, what brought him to Africa? And Michael came into my mind because I do know that a lot of Myconians went to Africa as teachers. But could you talk about, if you were to say that there is a particular identity that allowed for the survival and the adaptability in a situation that could have been quite suffocating and hostile? What was responsible for the making it work?
Yeah, I think one of the things we have to admit is that the pull to return came and has come in multiple ways. In some ways, it's almost a kind of opportunity. You are somebody who is educated, and you decide that this is an opportunity to earn a living somewhere else, and so on, and that becomes one kind of pull essentially. But clearly, and then in some instances, it's a dream of return, a dream that comes out of recognizing in oneself a need to reconnect with an Africa, because you're trying to recreate a bridge into the past and to resist that absence. I think so. What I have to do is to ask the question with Levi, whether there was any evidence that he felt he was going to Africa to bring intellectual understanding to the savages, or any kind of prejudice or any kind of racism that was built into it. And the two things that struck me were the three articles that were in the newspaper, in the Gleaner newspaper, of his return to Jamaica, when he came back to Jamaica on 3 occasions. And the first thing he did was he established these conversations, these meetings with farmers. To me, that was a very interesting choice, that he didn't choose to come and give a lecture on, what he's learned about Africa in any anthropological way, but he was saying, look, there are things that these Africans are doing that makes sense to us. So that he seemed to be on the view that they were talking on equal terms. They were talking on equal levels. And I think that may have been one of the ways in which he found a place in Africa, and he found a place in Nigeria. Interestingly enough, my older sister, who visited the community where my grandparents were, found that their name was still being spoken about. They were still being spoken about. The schools were there. They remembered them. She visited there in the 70s, and they remembered him. They remembered his mother, the wife, and so on. So they clearly had a very positive experience in Nigeria at that time. There's so much more to learn, but I do think that I take some value in the boldness, in the boldness to say, I'm going into a new land and I'm going to make something of this, and I'm going to take my family with me, and then to have the family return with a positive sense of Africa, not a negative sense. So much so that my father would want to return to Africa and be a part of Africa as an equal in Africa. So for me, it is the legacy that comes through the evidence of behavior and patterns that I hold to be important. Yeah,
I really love that story and that engagement, because you underscore the fact that the intellectual flow was not going from a Eurocentric to an Afrocentric, but the
right.
value found in in the Afrocentric. I know Melissa, who is in the room with us, has her hand up. I'm going to ask her to make her contribution.
Thank you so much, Hugh. Professor Dawes, I sat here listening to you, and I must say, for me, it ended a little prematurely. I was so looking forward to so much more. I was so taken in by the story you were telling. But I noticed as you spoke that you, at different times, delineated and differentiated between Nigeria and Ghana and so on. But then, even in your response just now, you also use the word Africa quite a bit. And there are perhaps those of us in the diaspora who have this understanding that it is not quite correct to say Africa in that way. And it for our understanding, well, certainly my understanding is that that may be a bit offensive since Africa is a continent. Clarify your use of the term Africa in how you speak and what you mean when you use this broad term in explaining this migrant story, this movement story, this family story.
Yeah. I'm a little surprised that anybody would be offended by the use of the term Africa. That strikes me as peculiar. But let me say that we don't struggle with using the term European. We don't seem to struggle with the term American, which is a broad space and so on. So I think the key thing is an awareness. So if I say Africa, I'm doing two things. I'm recognizing that there's a continent, and there's a continent that has been treated in a particular way by the Western world as a whole. Whether they are right or wrong about it, we know that it's wrong to sort of lump Africa as to one place, but the colonial enterprise did treat it as such. And the process of resisting it, I'm not inventing this, by Nkrumah, by even Gaddafi, by anybody who, Nyerere and so on, was to first recognize that in order to resist those ideas was to recognize that as a continent, this Africa has been treated in a particular way, and that our unity comes from recognizing that we share the same enemy, the same oppressive structures. So when Walter Rodney writes how Europe underdeveloped Africa, what he's doing is that he's setting the terms for the broader systematic approach about a continent, a whole continent. That is a reality, that's a fact, right? And then if you read his book, he goes through all the different parts of Africa that it's been affected and in the different ways that it's been affected. But it doesn't change the fact that Europe got together and said, we are going to exploit that continent of Africa. So one of the things you will hear me, you did well to recognize that there were times when I would speak specifically of Ghana, speak specifically of the Delta region of Nigeria, and then there are times when I would speak of Africa, because Africa then becomes both a conception politically as a conception, mythologically as a conception, and a mythology that is both one of that has been destructive, but a one that has actually found its survival through that. Because of course, when we think of South Africa, for instance, and the movement against apartheid, you can hear the way in which people like Nelson Mandela will praise Africans who joined in that struggle, Africans from other parts of Africa who joined in that struggle to bring about that liberation. So for me, the term Africa is used with understanding and is used with nuance. But I can't imagine who would be offended by its use. I don't think Africans would be.
Okay, thank you for that response, Professor Dawes. And I think there was another comment on YouTube, which is of the same vein. Someone says a dated view of what it means to be of African descent. How do you reconcile that with the sentiments you have? I think you clarified that a while ago.
So they were saying my view was dated? Is that what they were saying?
Yes, please don't kill the messenger.
Yeah, I wish they had said more about what would be a more
Right.
update.
I too would like to know if the person would want to clarify that that use of dated. And I know we have Dr. Goss who's gonna make a contribution. I just want to read very quickly, Dr. Goss, that Chad Nehemiah from YouTube said, "Thank you for that excellent analysis, Professor Dawes. I appreciated the references to musicians of the time as they convey the societal groove." As you mentioned, musicians, your drama, that's the name of the group that you were a part of.
Yes.
Or still, do you still perform with your drama?
No. Ujama has been defunct for many, many, many years. But that was in my wayward youth. Yes.
Another similarity you share with Stuart Hall was also a part of a band when he was at the West Indian Students Union
Yeah, they were all jazz musicians, and that was the connection he had with my father. My father was a jazz pianist as well, so they were, yeah.
Oh,
And
well, we need to
Stuart Hall was very generous to me. I remember doing readings in England, and he came to the readings and so on. He's very, very kind man and a brilliant thinker, but somebody who supported the work of writers of color, Black writers, and wherever they were, and so on. So I have a very fond sense of Stuart Hall. Yeah.
Wonderful. Dr. Goss.
Yes, Prof, thank you so very much for your lecture. Very interesting and thought-provoking. And two things jog in my mind. And it relates to the issue of the missionaries. Because we know a lot of missionaries. I know, I'm assuming that your father also was part of the Baptist movement. I'm making an assumption. I know that very early, like in the 1840s or so, they formed their own missionary society. And what is I find so interesting is that the literature kind of suggests that part of the reason for the formation of the Baptist Mission Society was to encourage Jamaicans, former enslaved Jamaicans, to go back to Africa to help the savages. That was part of what a number of the persons actually write about the intention of the Baptist Mission Society. So I'm just wondering historically in terms of how typical your father, if you know how typical your father was in terms of having a different agenda and the implications of that bilateral cultural relation in that sense, how typical he was, or is it that in a sense that literature needs to be really updated, that many missionary Jamaican who went to Africa went with a similar intention to build that kind of cultural understanding between the diaspora and the homeland. So I'm making a comment on that particular observation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex question because what you're dealing with is it's individuals who are engaging with their own lives and their own faith and their idea of faith. I was, I think it may have been a motivation for somebody who was a Christian. I think my grandfather would have been a Christian, to say that part of the benefit of what he's doing is that he can proselytize and he can spread the gospel to in Africa. What he may have encountered in the process of doing that would have been, I think, instructive to him. But let's sort of be clear about it. I mean, you characterize it very interestingly as, because they were Christians going to proselytize, they saw the people who they were going to proselytize as savages. And speaking of dated, I think that might be a slightly dated read of it, in a sense that in the sense that there's a lot of ways in which attitudes that we carry in Jamaica towards Africans is predicated on Christianity, the idea of Christianity, right? That, you know, we think of a poet like Phyllis Whitley, who has to say, no, thank goodness I was taken out of Africa to be a slave, because at least I met Jesus. I got this salvation. But I cannot take that part of Phyllis Whitley's articulation, which is her own wrestling with herself and with her faith, and dismiss Phyllis Whitley entirely. In other words, I think of somebody like Stuart Hall or even my father, who both articulated their complex confusion that they had to wrestle with, that they spoke with Oxford accents, and yet they were revolutionary and African and Pan-Africanist and Marxist. So what do you do with that? They admitted to their struggle with it. And for me, I see the wrestling as very, very important. So to the point where my father, I remember him writing about his novel and saying he's trying to write a novel that speaks to the Jamaican voice, but he keeps being haunted by the colonial expectation in his head. And he doesn't know whether he would be able to shake it and write the great Jamaican novel. But he said there's a boy probably running around right now. This was something he wrote in 1960. There's a boy probably running around right now who is about to write that. Somebody who is going to write in the language of Jamaica and write something revolutionary and powerful. In other words, he had the wherewithal to understand his troubled self. It's what, like Walcott saying, divided in the vein. It's a troubled self, and I have to reach for something that's positive. So I can't sit here in retrospect and make a judgment about the agenda or what people were trying to do or what motivated them in their everyday life. But I want the legacy of their existence in that conversation not to be erased and not to be thrown away. I imagine in my own mythology that boy that my father was talking about was Bob Marley, right? And I imagine that he may not have written a novel, but my God, has he written an epic of that comes out of our culture and so on and so forth. But there's nothing wrong about the men and women who understood their wrestling and understood what they were struggling with and what they had to fight against to come about in a liberated way. We talk about Louise Bennett a lot and so on and so forth, but Louise Bennett always wrestled with this question of what is good speaking and what is patois speaking, and trying to argue, always wanted to say, I can talk good too, right? That is all built into it. Let's make no mistake about it. But that is because of the ways in which colonialism, the ways in which slavery had shaped us. And our process is one of constant liberation and transformation and so on. And we will all go through that same wrestling in ourselves as well. And for me, the evidence of the wrestling is the hope.
Thank you so much for that response. It's interesting because, as you mentioned, the idea of your father wrestling to write that and find that voice. Again, that's a Stuart Hall situation as well. He struggled to find the Jamaican voice and had that insider-outsider situation that you mentioned that you have experienced in your own life. I want to go to a couple other questions that have come up, and I'm going to preamble this by saying that I have had the pleasure of going to Ghana for Panafest, to Cape Coast, to Elmina. When you mentioned them, you brought images and experiences that I have had. Interestingly, I met one of the forerunners for the papacy right now, Cardinal Peter Turkson, when I was there with St. George's and St. Catherine High, doing a performance, and he hosted the two schools from the Archdiocese of Kingston. Again, showing that the African church is now leading Europe and sending missionaries to Jamaica and other places as well, a kind of colonization in reverse. But you have a question here from YouTube. What do you make of present-day organized homecomings of African Americans and Caribbean nationals to West Africa as a collective influenced by efforts to connect the diaspora with the continent? Are you skeptical about this, seeing it more about tourism, sightseeing, touristic culture, rather than any real authentic seeking after cultural roots?
I'm not skeptical about it. I mean, first of all, I think, you know, one of the things I tried to say was that everybody has to walk their path and deal with their own motivation for their connections and their understanding of their history and their past based on their present moment. I do think that this movement towards looking to Africa, especially for African Americans, is one that is predicated on this idea that if you decide if you live in a world in which you live in a country in which the idea of a history for you as a person stops often at the Atlantic coast and not beyond. All you have is this massive place called Africa that you know you came from. You don't even know where you came from in that regard. Now, this is a generalization, and I think we've been trying to see that change slowly with greater study of DNA and cultural practices and traces. And there's a lot of evidence for that. You know, the Gullah people in South Carolina and their relationship to parts of Senegal and parts of Gabon and so on and so forth, and the Gambia and so on. They're actual lines of connection that we can look at, food trails and so on. But why do people make that journey? I think people make that journey because they are trying to fill a kind of void of memory. Now, listen, Marcus Garvey was very interested in running major businesses in Africa. Marcus Garvey was explicit about it. He said the colonizers shouldn't make the money in Africa. We as Africans are inheritors of that money. So and much of what has passed for interesting cultural exchanges with, you know, Dizzy Gillespie, Satchmore, and so on, so was funded by the CIA as an effort to win American interest in Africa. These global global and geopolitical realities are things you cannot deny. However, what is still present is that we are dealing with a period of enslavement and erasure that is still affecting Black people all over the world, and them finding a path towards a change in themselves about that legacy and that past strikes me as always a good thing. Remember what I said, the hope is in the wrestling, the hope is in the struggle. It's not necessarily in the conclusion of it, but in the struggle. If you're not struggling, then I think you have a problem.
So I endorse that. I must say that visiting Ghana and being at Cape Coast on the night of emancipation was a transformative experience for the 40 children from Jamaica.
Yes.
They talk about it from 2001 till this very day, that it changed their lives.
And I'm sure when they went into the market, they thought they could understand what people were saying because of the rhythms of the voices, but they were saying, I don't understand, but I know what they're saying.
But they know. And they
know what they're saying. I can see their body, our body. Yeah, it's transformative. It's a powerful thing.
That look just like Jamaica.
Exactly.
They saw people.
Yes.
The then Prime Minister said to us, that was PJ Patterson, who said that you're gonna see people you know. You're gonna, and I tell you, I saw Sister Susie from Ebonavia Church right here in Ghana.
Exactly.
Are you? Also, there's another question from YouTube. What do you think are the biggest misconceptions in how African history is taught in our schools? How can a diasporic perspective help correct or enrich that narrative? I'm glad they picked up on that, because your people who came story really helped me. You had great teachers at JC.
Yeah. I'm going to return to something that the person who was asking the question about the use of the word Africa, something that they said, which is absolutely correct. I think one of the damaging ways in which African history is taught is to treat it is not to recognize that these are different countries in Africa, but these are, there are thousands of languages throughout Africa, the size of Africa. In other words, the big mistake is to totalize Africa. There's a fundamental difference between a Tunisian and somebody from Djibouti. These are all part of the continent of Africa. So I want to affirm what the person was asking and saying and suggesting that that it is true that if you lump the term altogether, then you're not doing a good teaching. You recognize it as a continent, but you recognize it as a continent of multiple voices, multiple cultures, multiple intelligences that have contributed in very different ways to the world. And I think this is one of the challenges. The other thing that that I've fought sort of adamantly, the work that we do with the African Poetry Book Fund, we've published over 200 African poets in the last 15 years, 14 years. That work has been predicated on the idea that Africa is on equal terms. Africa is not a place for mercy or for charity. Africa is a place in which its intellectual value is contributing and transforming the rest of the world, and that we understand that. And that has never been different. It has always been the case. It has always been the case. And the failure to recognize that and to admit that is built into the processes that needed to happen to destroy and oppress a people by creating lies and narratives and erasing histories and so on. So there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of exciting work to be done. And I think sort of recognizing those differences and those histories would be one of the first things that need to happen in the teaching about Africa. Yeah.
And as you talk about the intellectual tradition, as a literary practitioner yourself, I was jolted back to the fact that one of my first introductions to the kind of tension and dilemma and conflict that is experienced even in Africa came about by having to do Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, and the ways in which that was a part of the high school project that made us lose some of the stereotypes that may have been advanced locally about Africa. There's a comment here from Professor Cohenberg, she's quoting you, a line of amnesia along the coast of Africa. She says it's so true and aptly worded. A question here, in your own family history, across the generations, how was the question of religion treated or wrestled with? For example, Christianity, African religions, Rastafarianism. I heard that sitting with the elders, it reminded me of Jesus in the temple at 12 years old when you mentioned that childhood practicing engagement with the Rastafari elders. Could you talk about how your family dealt with Christianity versus African spirituality and Rastafari, for that matter?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I assume I didn't grow. My grandfather died before I was born, so I didn't know him personally. That's my grandfather on my father's side. My grandmother was clearly a committed Christian. She attended the last years of her life in Jonestown Baptist Church there in Kingston, and so she clearly came from that. My father himself for many years clearly grew up in church, but he declared, constantly, remember him saying that, he doesn't know who J. Christ Esquire is, but he talked about that. He said ancestors sort of live in the earth and exist, So my father had first a strong Marxist sensibility. So he was dealing with his own idea and sort of contention and wrestling with Christianity that he was brought up with, and also asking the question about atheism or his Marxism, or in many instances he talked about ancestral worship and the ancestral belief systems. And I think in my own immediate family, my siblings and so on and so forth, we found our different paths, but we engaged, my mother was raised Catholic from Ghana. But I became a Christian in the conventional sense of Christianity, not Catholic, but part of the charismatic movement and so on. And one of the greatest struggles in my life was to reconcile the idea of a relationship with Christianity with the knowledge of Christianity's abhorrent and destructive behavior to Africans and in the perpetuation of slavery and enslavement. I can talk to anybody who wants to talk to me about how that was worked out, but it had to be worked out. So So for me, it's fascinating to me. I remember, and one of the things that connected me with Rastafarianism was the quest to find an African sensibility, yet still wrestling with this idea of Judeo-Christianity. Whether, and again, my task is never to, it's the same thing with Voodoo. It's the same thing with Pocomania. It's the same thing with cultures that have had to come to terms with gods that have come to them from different places, and how do you contend with that, and how do you deal with that? At the end of the day, I think that is a narrative of the personal. But as a critic, as somebody who is looking at it and asking questions, is to examine the ways in which belief systems and structural belief systems, mythologies, and so on and so forth, can shape social constructions and social organizations and the way that that people live in the world. There is clearly great comfort for many people when they look to, when I remember visiting, Addis Ababa, and visiting the temples of Addis Ababa. The first Christian churches were in Ethiopia. This is historically true. So what do you do with that? And yet at the same time, Islam is all over Africa, but I'm publishing poets who are wrestling with their relationship to Islam vis-a-vis the destruction of their indigenous cultures and their indigenous understandings of themselves. So for me, it's a rich, complex thing, and one that I do not dictate for everybody. Everybody kind of has to have their own path. But I think it's an awareness of the implications of those paths that strikes me as most important. Yeah.
Wow, wonderful. What a rich engagement this has been, Professor Dawes. Judith Salmon is saying, let me scroll up. Judith Salmon says, thank you for sharing the family story of return and engagement in Africa. I'm going to ask one more question. I know we have several that are coming through, but in the interest of time, I'm going to ask one more question. This says, in your own cultural engagement with Africa and the Caribbean, as we have heard in the introduction and your own presentation, can you speak to the ways in which one of your seminal works attempts to contribute to a kind of literary intervention in recentering the significance of Africa in the Caribbean? Africa has often been decentered in the Caribbean.
Yeah, I would say that all my work is engaged in that business because, of course, I'm an African who came to Jamaica. Just to be clear about that. So validating that connection and that my Jamaicanness and my Ghanaianness and my Africanness as being part of a larger narrative. I'm an African Jamaican who went to live in South Carolina and to live among Black people in South Carolina and African Americans, and to find them embracing me and protecting me and looking after me, creating the sense of recognition that this diaspora has a point of connection and validity through respect, through recognition of the stories that we've told ourselves and that we tell each other. So I'm very optimistic about that. So in many ways, I think my poetry, Requiem is a book in response to the artwork of an African-American artist called Tom Feelings, the book was called Black Ships, White Cargo. And it's a stunning book of drawings looking at the Middle Passage. And I wrote those poems in response to that as a way, again, to express a gratitude for him to make that connection of the Middle Passage. Even my work, Bob Marley, Lyrical Genius, which is a critical work, is also exploring that question of what is that legacy? Because the truth is that the biggest power that comes out of reggae music is an affirmation of Africa. An affirmation that people laughed at, people poo-pooed, and so on and so forth. But I know it transformed the ways in which Jamaican attitudes to Africa were changed in the 1970s. They were changed. You can say what you want, but it's a fact. And it's partly because of that work and the work of the Institute of Jamaica, the African Caribbean Institute of Jamaica, work of bringing in people like, Julius Nyerere to Jamaica, Samora Machel, all those years where those voices came in and spoke. Those were ways in which we began to understand ourselves, to have this connection. So, so I think I regard it as not my mission, but the gift that's been given to me to be able to write out of that space. As Toni Morrison very beautifully articulated, she said when she was once asked the question, that said, when are you going to write the novel that has white characters about white characters so that you can show yourself to be now finally a true and great novelist? And she was so angry with that. She said, I cannot exhaust the stories and the power and the meaning of this experience of Africans and African Americans in the world. I can barely scratch the surface. And now you are coming to tell me that there is limit to this. A thing that you would never say to Nabokov, a thing that you would never say to any of your so-called white novelists. You never demand of them that, and now you're telling me this. And I share that sentiment, that chagrin, that anger, and that desire to say there is so much to write, there is so much to tell in our people and in our stories. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Kwame Dawes, our fifth Stuart Hall Distinguished Lecturer, for presenting 150 years of intellectual and cultural engagement with the African diaspora, a family's story. What a rich engagement. There are so many other questions about mythologies and so on that I hear emerging from your work, but we will have to continue that engagement at another time. It sounds like we need a part B to this. But thank you also for honoring your own ancestors through this talk. I think it's one of the kinds of lines of work that needs to be much more explored for people who don't know that there are these stories that can richly benefit us all. But I am not the one who is supposed to tell your thanks properly. There is my colleague who I'm going to now invite to give the vote of thanks. Miss Melissa Beckford, MPhil Cultural Studies candidate, will now give the vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Hugh Dawes, who you have been the captain of this event this evening. Thank you so much. And I dare say, Hugh, that it was not the Titanic at all. it was the Windrush, the HMS Windrush, because for whatever it was, it got somewhere. And yes, this was what it was. But let me thank Professor Kwame Dawes. It is such an honor to meet you, even though it's online. It's such an honor. I grew up with so much of your poetry and of your writing, and I was always so fascinated. But for some reason, the poetry it didn't come to me as well as it did for you, and I struggled with it. But I listened to you this evening, poet, playwright, actor, director, producer, writer, and I think my colleague Candia said architect, and I would add to that builder and painter, because what you have done this evening at this fifth Stuart Hall lecture is to skillfully design and build for us this story of your life. You painted this rich tapestry of, what you call family history. But what I heard as you went along, I heard poetry coming out just as you spoke. And Candida did say eminence. We are in the presence of eminence. And I want to say that I fancy myself now to be quite the poet, having been so close in proximity to you, and even having this very, very, very great honor to tell you thanks for this evening. You drew us in with the simplicity of your artistry. That's what I noticed about how you spoke. It was, you just spoke, and yet there was so much artistry in that. And as a budding academic, I took copious notes. I heard themes, central themes in cultural studies, themes that Stuart Hall spoke about and wrote about and left that legacy for us. Space and body and geographies, all of these are central themes. And I dare say, Professor Dawes, that you are the boy. You are the boy because you were in his loins. You are the boy that would one day write that your father spoke about. We heard that tonight. We heard so much of that this evening, and I thank you for presenting, for being available, making yourself available to speak for us. And I hope that you will be available at another time for us to engage with you a little bit more, because there's so many questions to ask of you, even as we are in this whole many different conversations about reparations and all these kinds of things, So there are so many other things to talk about. But thank you for presenting to us. I must also thank, of course, Mr. Hugh Dawes for, as I said, captaining. I heard somebody use the word captain earlier, and I don't know if it is true, but I still want to thank the captain that you were this evening for this program, and what a way how you have steered the program. I want to thank Professor Koenberg, Dr. Goss, the head of the department, Dr. Candia Mitchell Hall, who did the introduction so very eloquently. I listened to the introduction and I was taken in with the introduction as much as I was with the actual presentation. Other faculty members who are here, who are online on YouTube, students of the UA and from other places, and just a wider viewer and listenership on YouTube, those of you who are listening in. Members of the technical team led so ably by Mrs. Bettine Ross-Laws, who is just absolutely awesome, is what we say at ICS. And the other members of the team, Miss Onika Young, and others from the technical team, who made this, put everything together to make sure that this lecture was what it really was. Very, very awesome. Thank you again. Thank you for tuning in to the 5th Stuart Hall lecture and for just being a part of it so far. Thank you so much. Back to you, Mr. Dawes.
And thank you so much, Melissa, Miss Melissa Beckford, MPhil candidate in the Institute of Caribbean Studies, for thanking us. Please, everyone, continue to watch this space for the kinds of riveting, rich, powerful engagement such as we had this evening for the 5th Stuart Hall lecture. And once more, thanks to Professor Kwame Dawes, our presenter this evening. Have a wonderful evening, everyone, and God bless you all. Please continue to be kind to everyone and keep following the ICS. God bless.